Hello and welcome back to Philosophy 1029, Searching for Reality. And this week's lesson is on Socrates and Plato in ancient Athens. Over the last 2 weeks, we've looked at the pre-Socratics, which obviously is the time prior to Socrates. And there we saw a variety of different explanations that moved towards some understanding about reality as we saw it, experienced it, and thought about it. And the two main paths that we saw expressed were the following: empiricism and rationalism. Empiricism uses sense data, the senses, and builds up an understanding of the world from a material perspective. The rational view is one that uses reason, that goes beyond the material world into laws and an understanding about something, about the world as we experience it. So it, yes, uses sense data, but moves much further. Once again, here, we're going to see the same sort of thing occurring with Plato as he too tries to do the same thing as we saw pre-Socrates do last week, which was to try to reconcile these two tendencies and see if each individual, as much as they seem to be in opposition to one another, may have some truth in their particular perspective on the world. Now, I just want to mention, before we go any further, quiz number 1 is open and will be open till October 11th, 11:59 p.m., of course. Don't forget to finish it. And before the midterm grades are due, there will be one more quiz. And I think the midterms are going to be due, I believe, at the end of week 6. So we have one right now that covers the first 2 modules, and then there'll be another one covering the next 2 modules. So do have a look on the quiz boards or the pull-down menu for quizzes in FOL for the specific dates. But certainly the first one that's coming up is on right now and is due by October the 11th. Okay, so let's sort of move into our lesson and kind of situate ourselves. We'll use the old sort of film metaphor, the establishing shot. Okay, where are we here as we zero in and we go from simply looking at ancient Greece, which was, again, did not technically exist, but was a series of city-states or a polis. And as we move into a particular one, Athens. Now, Athens was considered to be democratic. Now, it is very much in quotations because the notion of democracy in Athens is a very, very different one than that we know of it today. And one of the main reasons is because democracy at this point, it's a particular kind. We'll get to that. It's called direct democracy. But over and above the notion of democracy being different, the most important one in ancient Athens is that only, first of all, men, and secondly, propertied men, landed men. In other words, individuals who owned property or businesses. The belief was that these individuals were the people who had the most to gain or lose if a law went through that either they didn't know about or did not participate in creating. So keep that in mind. The notion of democracy being born in Athens is not a misnomer or a mistake. The idea is sound. It is the way in which it is expressed. And what have I just done? I've done exactly what we've talked about here, where I've looked at the empirical examples of democracy versus the idea of it. So the particular example in ancient Athens was a very poor one, right? Only landed men could discuss the lawmaking in the agora, in the marketplace, and then would go on to vote on these particular laws. So literally the rest of Greek society was unable to talk about any of these issues. They may suffer under those laws, but the belief was that those individuals that had property and were men were the ones that would gain or lose the most from a change in a particular law. So, but the idea is sound. The notion of participation, the notion of individuals sitting down and defining their own reality, their social and political and legal reality. This is what is radically new about Athens. It's a remarkable thing because suddenly individuals come together and the tools that they use are the tools we will discuss here today, which is the ability to discuss morality and ethics. Political ideas, political philosophy begins at this point. So we have a unique situation where perhaps the example of democratic functions are somewhat lacking, we'll say, to be honest, but the idea is there. And the idea is participation by individuals in the creation of laws for their own society. That's the part that is mind-blowing. Gods are no longer referred to in the creation of these laws. These laws, in a sense, come from the ground up, right? Rather from the top down. The top, of course, being the gods and goddesses. So that is the part that is remarkable. So let's keep that in mind. That's our context that we're going to use to discuss some of these further ideas. And for the sake of clarity, we'll call it democratic Athens, right? And we're talking about the era of around 500 BC. And not only is it a unique situation in Athens, because in Sparta and other city-states, the notion of democracy just isn't there. And as far as we know, Sparta, for example, the other probably the second most important city-state in this area, had not only no democracy, it had no philosophy, which is, again, remarkable. So always remember, when we talk about ancient Greek philosophy, even that is a misnomer. It should be ancient Athenian philosophy. It only came in Athens. So anytime we discuss any issues that pertain to the ancient world, it's not only not the ancient Greek world, but it is in fact specifically the ancient Athenian world. So let's remember that. Now, into this Athenian world, around 500 BC, are a number of different factors that we're now going to unpack and take a look at. The first thing are the Sophists. And the Sophists are a group of philosophers, skeptical or otherwise, who move away from the scientific explanations that we've looked at over the last 2 weeks with the pre-Socratics, and now move to more, or what they thought were more important questions pertaining to what we used to call man in society, which is offensive to fully half of the population. Individuals in society, social individuals in society. What is that relationship? What should it be? What ought to be the most important issues that matter to individuals who live in a given society? And what we're talking about here for the first time, which also makes it quite radical, are ideas like ethics and morality and political philosophy. These ideas are sort of brought into fruition for the first time. And the reason why this occurs now is because we have this new form of government. It's not an autocracy. It's not an oligarchy. It's a democracy. So it isn't run by a king. It isn't run by a cache of priests. It is now run by elected officials. Again, quite mind-blowing. This is radically new stuff. This is the first time this occurs that we know of, because remember, other civilizations like the civilization in Crete was thousands of years older, Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian. We don't know as much about their civilizations from a political angle. We have remnants from artifacts and so on. But in terms of this specific form of political philosophy, democracy, democratic thinking, this is, again, very specific to Athens. So this is a new form of government, and along with anything that's brand new, we need to nurture it. We need to carefully allow it to grow. And this is where we see for the first time thinkers that worry very much about democratic institutions, the notion of democracy, because it is a fragile thing. Democracy and society itself is an imaginary institution. We carry this idea around in our heads, and we are reminded of that imaginary institution every time we interact with people. And we have to interact with them morally and ethically, and not use them as a means to an end, not to lie to them, not to manipulate them and coerce them into doing things. All these things become very important to the ancient Athenians as they try to help along this brand new political system called democracy. Now, as it begins to falter, like anything else will falter, well, guess who's at the front of the line to criticize it? Socrates and Plato. And one of the first things that they did say And this should come as absolutely no surprise because we are experiencing it right now in the US. Plato and Socrates both knew that contained within democracy were the seeds of populism and demagoguery. Now, what does that mean? Populism is speaking to people, to individuals in such a way that you conjure up nationalistic tendencies. And what that is in and of itself not a bad thing because you want to be proud about your country. But populism descends further into very veiled forms of racism and ethnocentrism. This notion of populism is presenting the world as not only sort of it's gone off the rails and only I can turn around and I can fix that and we can make Athens great again and we can come back and be this powerful nation that we once were, etc., etc., based on absolutely no credible evidence. But the idea is very rich, it's very persuasive and influential. And Socrates and Plato are the first, not surprisingly, because democracy is now brought into being for the first time. Socrates and Plato see within democracy the seeds of this kind of thinking. Because as people appeal to others to vote for them, you are you're going to begin to manipulate them. And that's where populism comes in. You start manipulating people and their emotional connection to where they live. And eventually, when you are using people and in order to get elected, and you are speaking to them on an emotional level, reason and rationality go out the window. And people start thinking about these ideas that, make Athens great again. Well, how? Well, it doesn't matter. We'll do it. And the people that are doing this kind of thinking and speaking in this particular way are demagogues. And Trump is probably one of the best / worst examples of demagoguery. He has created a cult. He has created a cult around him. He is a sort of apex alpha male, which in itself is a failed metaphor. But this notion of this sort of apex alpha male in charge, only I can fix it. He has said those exact words. That's populism and demagoguery to a T. And here we are, well, essentially 2,500 years ago, having that pointed out to us. That contained in democracy are the seeds for something far worse, which is populism and demagoguery. And of course, populism, an excellent but horrible example, is when these demagogues begin to whip up people's feelings about immigration. All right? They're polluting our land. They're letting people from all over coming in. Yeah, that's populism. It's this myth that at some point this land, right, this nation that we speak of, was somehow pure and unadulterated and somehow better. Well, in the U.S., for example, those kinds of arguments usually forget that America was built on the backs of slaves, right? Populism would ignore that issue. And it is a horrible thing, but there it is, identified by Socrates and Plato 2,500 years ago, that this is what will happen to democracy if we're not careful. So we need to be very mindful of what it is that we consider to be important. So the Sophists were itinerant or wandering intellectuals. They were essentially teachers. They were teachers that were well versed in the art of rhetoric. And the art of rhetoric was, again, in and of itself, a good thing, because it was a useful skill that could be used by individuals to persuade people. Now, persuading, in this case here, is not a pejorative or an inferior term. You wish to inspire people. And notice how I've used two different words. On the one hand, I'm saying, I'm going to inspire you to do something, as opposed to persuade you. Now, which of those two words leans closer to the other word, coercion? Persuasion, isn't it? Because if I've inspired you to do something, it's coming from within, and you're going, yes, I should do this. But when you're persuading someone, there's in the background a hint of manipulation. There's a hint of coercion. And the only way in which you get someone to do something that they feel truly inspired to do is by doing just that, inspiring them. And the Sophists, by certain individuals, again, Socrates and Plato, they were viewed negatively. They may have been wandering intellectuals that were well versed in the art of rhetoric and these other sort of rhetorical skills, and they would teach these skills to, again, to ambitious young men, right? In other words, men who wish to get into politics, men who wish to work in the legal system. Now, a lawyer who doesn't have rhetorical skills is probably a not very good lawyer. And if that is the case, they're often going to lose whatever case they have in front of them. So if you are well versed in rhetorical skills and you're using them in a way to inspire someone to believe a certain idea or go and do something, then have at it, right? So Sophists had these skills that were on the surface very useful to ambitious young men who wish to then move on to other fields that would require this skill, right? The legal system, right, because there was one. So in law or in politics. Some were also philosophers. We know Protagoras, for example, believed that, and this is one of his statements, that man is the measure of all things. Now just let that sink in for a moment. Man is the measure of all things. That's a remarkable statement when you consider that Protagoras saying this is implying that not only are we the measure of all things, we can create that perfect world. We will decide, not the gods, we will decide what we think is good, what we think is just, what we think is ethical. So man is the measure of all things. We are the device by which we look at something and decide whether it is good and just or bad and unjust. And so if that is the case, then you could turn around and now not look so much to the gods for help, but in fact look within yourself and one's imagination. So if man is the measure of all things, then we can turn around and say that, look, something like morality, the value system that we hold dear and we express through our ethical behavior, that itself is a human creation. So we have created the duties and laws and imperatives that we should follow in order to maintain democracy and maintain a society that is beneficial for all. So these individuals, these philosophers, and you can say some sophists were good and were useful to the public discourse on morality, ethics, and politics. But Protagoras is known to have said, man is the measure of all things. And that's what he meant, that man is the person, humanity, decides what it considers to be good and just. And so if that's the case, then we should be the ones that make moral laws, because it is a human creation, not a divine or supernatural creation. Now, Socrates disagreed. That's what Socrates does. He's critically minded and will always dispute arguments that really at the end of the day are somewhat subjective, because Socrates, because he is much more aligned with Plato and rational thinking rather than empirical thinking, he disagrees because he says, look, there have to be objective moral truths. These are just opinions, and these are opinions based on rhetoric. And remember, I just told you, you can manipulate and persuade and coerce people into thinking in a certain way. So be very careful with this idea that man is a measure of all things. Man can be manipulated. We can be influenced indirectly or in the wrong way. So, as we mentioned, the clients, the students of the Sophists tended to be aristocratic families, or the sons of aristocratic families. And these teachers of rhetoric and rhetorical devices and skills were, for the most part, viewed by Plato and Aristotle with some level of suspicion. Now, within this, or in brackets, is also the fact that Socrates and Plato are also using rhetorical devices. They just don't want it to be known. They would like to keep that for themselves. Just putting it out there. So the individuals who were being taught by the Sophists were coming from wealthy aristocratic families. Now, this should come as no surprise, because only they would be allowed to formulate laws, pass laws, debate laws, strike down ones that are not just or good and replace them with better ones. So, of course, this is where you would find the ideal student for a sophist. But what was more important was this idea of using rhetoric which are a set of tools. Rhetoric are a set of verbal or written tools that allow you to make sometimes a weak argument appear stronger or appear better. And if that's the case, a bad argument may win over the day because it has persuaded people that it is better. And yet, truly, it isn't. Sophists knew this, and they even often would go out of their way and consciously take the weaker side and win the argument. And we could say in hindsight, maybe they were doing this on purpose. Maybe they were showing that you need to argue differently to be effective. But certainly sophists were known to be able to make a weak argument appear strong. And it is that really, to me, that concerns Socrates perhaps more than anything else. So let's get to Socrates now. Socrates was this interesting character that we don't know really a whole lot about other than secondary sources. Now, is that unusual? No, it's not, because we can say the same thing of many of the pre-Socratic thinkers. Many of their actual writings, their specific writings are gone, and we only know about them simply through secondhand sources, whether they are Plato or Aristotle or other writers. So we need to be mindful that our understanding of the pre-Socratics is not often from first-hand information. In other words, their own writings, they're unfiltered through the critical mind of Socrates or Plato or Aristotle. But in the case of Socrates, we know about him through primarily the writings of Plato and a few other sources. And Socrates, as far as we know, never wrote anything down. And so the dialogues of Plato, and this is the way in which Plato wrote practically everything, was as a set of dialogues. Now, you could ask a question, okay, why would Plato write this way? Very briefly, the reason why was because Plato believed that the written language would corrupt the ability of individuals to know of the world. Now, remember, the world at this point is very small. Right? It's literally the city-state and maybe a few miles around. So they're not traveling internationally. They're not, well, put it this way, encyclopedias didn't exist back then, because everything that you knew or should know, according to Plato, you should be able to learn firsthand. In other words, you should experience things firsthand in order to know them truly. And he believed that the written word, the written language, which, remember, around 750 BC had now just come back. A new Greek written alphabet had just been devised because it had basically fallen away into disuse during the Dark Ages around 1200 BC. And over a period of time, the Greeks looked to other sources of the written language and then come up with their own. So around 750 BC, which not ironically is also around the time of Homer and Hesiod, probably the two most famous epic poets of the ancient Athenian world. So we have the beginnings of this new Greek alphabet. People are writing things down. And Plato was concerned because he said, look, now I just have to read about something. I don't have to experience it firsthand. Secondly, I don't have the person in front of me to discuss and debate a particular point. What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And those are the two main reasons why Plato wrote in the dialogue form. So Plato's characters and let's say 3/4 of Plato's writings deal with Socrates as the main character. Socrates is a kind of tool, this critical tool. What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? No, I believe that's an attribute, not an essence, and on it would go. So Socrates was a kind of device. We could call it maybe a rhetorical device, but Socrates did exist. We know that, that's fairly sure, but Socrates works as a kind of device that allows Plato to question the other individuals who are also participating in the same dialogue. So Plato has essentially he's been able to win the battle, because what he's done now is he said, okay, the written word is not a dialogue. It is simply a monologue that I read. And everything I read, I'm experiencing secondhand. So what does Plato do by way of a remedy? He writes all of his works as if they were conversations between 2 or 3 or 4 different individuals who discuss something. And eventually, after unpacking this thing and rolling it every which way they can, and looking at it from every perspective, they finally come to a decision. Sometimes. Some dialogues, they don't. But boy, have they discussed this thing to death. The end result is you end up having a conversation between these individuals as they seek to establish something. What is the essence of justice? What is the essence of beauty? And so Plato is trying to show us how those individuals come to a decision, an understanding of what something is. So that's why he writes dialogues. And that's why Plato's main works are all exactly that. He does not write a story in the sense of, here are all the things that have happened, here are my ideas. No, Plato's not even not almost a character within his own works. He is simply the narrator. Now, remember too that Plato is also the writer. So clearly what he believes to be correct, you will see in his writings. So whatever he thinks the definition of beauty or justice or whatever it may be that he's discussing, what we see the characters agreeing to is what we should believe Plato also thinks is correct. So again, it's an ingenious way to get around this initial issue that the written language will stop conversation and dialogue, and secondly, will now present the world to us as simply based on memory, not experience. So it's a bit of a digression, but in case you've ever wondered why Plato writes dialogues, that's the main reason why, is because he felt very ambivalent about the written language. And yet, I have a book just right back here. That's not a picture. That's my actual library. I have a book, Plato's Dialogues. Literally, it's almost 3 inches thick. So for a guy who hated the language, he wrote an awful lot. So Socrates was his main character. Absolutely. So the only thing about that is what we're not sure exactly what Socrates believed in, but I think I will tentatively say this, that Socrates ultimately was someone that Plato really looked up to and admired because of his critical faculties. The fact that Socrates could get people to either explain the essence of something, and if they did not, and they failed because of his, what we'll find out shortly, called the Socratic Method, even Plato found that that was important because it was a way in which to understand the world. And even if it's not conclusive, there is at least a level of understanding that's been achieved that, no, we need to talk some more. So that was just very briefly about Socrates. Now we'll move back again to trying to resituate Socrates into Athens. And we spoke at the beginning about democracy, right? Democracy is this brand new thing, this brand new political system. And what was unique about it, not only because was it just landed men or propertied men who were aristocratic and powerful and had money and influence, it was also something called direct democracy. And what that is, unlike what we have now, the notion of direct democracy is that individuals, citizens, right, subjects under the law, spoke directly. They spoke directly to the other, we'll call them constituents, right, in quotations, the other citizens of Athens. So they were directly involved in the creation of laws and the striking down of laws that they felt were inferior, and then would persuade others or inspire others to believe that their new version was a better one. But it was done directly. Now compare that to the system we have now in Canada and elsewhere around the world, where we vote in an elected representative. So think of that word for a moment. Representative. That person, he or she, will represent us. So we have an individual who will speak on our behalf. Now, depending on where you live, the whole range of individuals within a constituency, for example, could be quite far-reaching, based on gender, on sexual orientation, political affiliation, class, whether they're from here or is it primarily an immigration or immigrant neighborhood, is it a sort of an old standing one? All these things matter in the constituency that representative is now going to go in front of other representatives, also duly elected, and we'll discuss things. But the Athenian version of democracy was a direct one. So you and I would all go down to the agora, or would go to wherever they were meeting for a particular political reason, and we would participate directly. No one spoke on our behalf. And so if that's the case, if no one spoke on our behalf and we were discussing these issues on our own, we needed to have the best rhetorical skills to present our idea in the most inspiring / persuasive way. So this is why the Sophists are an important aspect, an important component of Athenian society, but also looked at with suspicion by Socrates and Plato, because they knew that there was those seeds of demagoguery and manipulation were already there, right? They were already there to be used by those that were either clever enough or thought they could get away with it. So if we are made aware of these rhetorical devices, we can call them out. And so if you take, for example, my critical thinking class, if it ever happens, those are the kinds of things that we learn. We learn critical thinking, but we learn the ways in which these rhetorical devices can be identified. And once they're identified, they can be undermined. So just because someone has these rhetorical devices doesn't mean they're an absolute genius. We can identify them and knock them down, or at least call them out. Say, your argument is not about the idea, it's about the individual. No, their arguments, if they are going to be objective and dispassionate, should always be about the idea. You should never attack the messenger, attack the message. And so direct democracy, where individuals, these landed men with property and money and wealth, are speaking in with the legislator at that particular time, or the governing council, those individuals always needed to make sure that they were speaking in the best way possible, right? They were representing themselves in the best way possible. So this is, again, as I mentioned earlier, a very important difference between what was there before, which was an aristocratic system. Now, guess what? Plato was an aristocrat. And this is one of the reasons why, in fact, so was Aristotle. And let's be honest, all the philosophers in one form or another were aristocrats. And these were people who had the kind of money that would allow them to have slaves, that would then allow them to sit back and basically think about the world, formulate ideas about the world. So yes, that part of democracy is horrible in ancient Athens, but we can see the idea of democracy as being essentially a sound one, to participate in the creation of laws, to, if not directly participate, have a representative speak on your behalf. So this form, this political system, which is brand new, replaces aristocratic despots. And those individuals often could be really awful. They could be overbearing. They could be demagogues. They could be warmongers. These people could be willing to sacrifice society at large for their own self-interests. Sound familiar? Here we are talking about a world 2,500 years ago, and we still hear echoes of it today, right? We're hearing it occurring in the U.S. I'm sorry I keep using the U.S. Canada is not perfect, but we seem to be, in terms of our political system, slightly better off. At least we have some choices. But at least in the U.S., we can see the ideas, the fears that Socrates and Plato had regarding democracy unfolding. So, aristocrats, now we would simply call them wealthy individuals right now. And we have lots of those in Canada as well. So let's not kid ourselves. What used to be aristocrats are now wealthy, powerful individuals. And they have vested interest in making sure that laws work for them. So in the US, for example, they have lobby groups. We probably have lobby groups in Canada as well. They seem to work maybe less sort of more, well, maybe the opposite. They work not in the open, but in fact behind the scenes. But in the U.S., lobby groups will do everything they can on behalf of these powerful individuals who, if they were Athenians, would have been aristocrats. So this is, again, another reason why these issues should be relevant and recognizable, because we're suffering the same sort of things right now that what we saw 2,500 years ago in Athens. So the notion that prior to democracy, it was an aristocratic system, and that aristocratic system, the aristocrats always trying to sort of grab power, right? Manipulate power to their own ends. So as the democratic system is sort of coming into being within 10 years, all right, 490 to 420, that's a very, very long time, 70 years, right? The Peloponnesian War is only one section of it. But the, I'm sorry, let me go back to this. I misread that. So we're talking about Protagoras. Sorry, 490 to 420 is not the time of the war. It was in fact his age. My mistake. So the democratic world of Athens at this point may have been wealthy, may have been peaceful, may have been functioning, but the Peloponnesian War, which, yes, definitely it ran almost 30 years between Athens and Sparta, essentially crippled and destroyed the democratic systems that were being built up very slowly within Athens. And war, plagues, health issues, atrocities committed on both sides destroyed a variety of Athenian institutions, and as a result was weakened comparatively to first to Sparta and then to Rome. And this period of time is considered the decline of this ancient Athenian empire of wisdom and philosophy and democratic institutions. And eventually all of this just falls apart. Now, Socrates, as much as he may have been critical of democracy, still served in the Athenian military. He still worked hard to maintain those institutions. And that's a bit of a paradox, because we'll find out soon just exactly what the price was that he paid for believing in these democratic institutions. So Socrates fought to maintain Athens as a they would have considered it an empire, but it was actually a city-state. But he fought to preserve that city-state and maintain the democratic institutions, and also was able to, and willing to always criticize those institutions. He believed in them, but he also reserved the right to argue against them. So here is a map of all the sort of the comings and goings of the various armies over that period of time. You can take a look at it here. For example, Ionia, where the pre-Socratic philosophers all came from this area, and from there over to Athens, not a very far, very far in terms of miles. So you can see how all of this was very, very close, and there was a lot of movement for a period of time, on and off for almost 30 years, regarding the Peloponnesian War. So it was a period of time where many of these institutions were destroyed and had to be rebuilt and reformulated, but clearly not in the way in which they had been prior. Right? They were destroyed irreparably. So peace and prosperity, right, was often as a result of the further expansion of Athens as it moved and tried to conquer other lands. And of course, as you can imagine, sort of a city-state that prides itself on being peaceful and wealthy, constantly being imperialistic at the same time. So Athens is a place filled with contradictions, because we have this peace-loving city-state, but with imperialist tendencies, right? In other words, looking to always push their borders further. And you eventually do this to the point where you are going to come into conflict with those groups that you are trying to overtake. And that's essentially what happened. So if you read the history of the Peloponnesian War, you'll find that is in fact what it is. It's a series of skirmishes that go on for a long period of time as Athens keeps trying to enlarge its influence, political influence, but it is still imperialistic. So it is, again, very paradoxical. And of course, they would often move into a particular area and would, say, look, are you with us or are you against us? And depending on where it was, this often would lead to absolute carnage and atrocities. And the Melanesians, for example, and the Melians, Melians, the Melians, they tried to be neutral. And if you are dealing with an imperialistic force, that's not always easy. And in the case of the Melians, they were massacred, right? The men were killed and the women and children were enslaved. So let's remember, right? There's the paradox. Peace-loving, wealthy, powerful, law-abiding, and yet imperialistic at the same time. And the end result is that we have Athenians massacring others and enslaving women and children. So far from perfect. Now, one of the really important aspects about Socrates is at the end of his life, and his life is taken from him, is the trial and the death of Socrates. And most individuals know Socrates. If you know a little bit about philosophy, is the fact that he was put to death or condemned to death by his fellow citizens for corrupting the youth, right? Or impiety, as what used to be called. Now, corrupting the youth, all Socrates did was try to teach them how to think critically. And you can imagine aristocrats who already are not fans of democracy are not looking favorably on Socrates and the Socratic method, always asking questions, always being critical. Why are you doing this? And what is the essence of that? And so corrupting the youth was a charge they were able to bring against him in the form of impiety. And the notion that he, Socrates, was creating these citizens that were not always going to accept the written word, the public discourse, right? The public ideas that were being presented. Now, it leads to a trial, to a conviction, and eventually an execution of Socrates by his citizens, by his fellow citizens. Again, when we say citizens, we mean landed, propertied men, wealthy men, aristocratic men. And so the story is told by Plato in a series of dialogues. And these stories deal with a series of other things, with metaphysics, with ethics, and especially with justice. Now, does the word justice sound familiar? Because it should. Because the way that Plato uses it is certainly not unlike the way Parmenides had used it last week, when he talks about justice as a form of balance. A balance in nature can be reproduced in a balance in society. And so keep that in mind, because when we talk about justice, it is a balance of power, right? A balance, an equal movement in both directions, right? In opposite directions, but equal, so that everything is kept in a balance. Now, the historical Socrates, we know he existed. We know that he fought in the Athenian army. His sons did, but never wrote anything down. Everything we know about him comes from Plato, Aristophanes, even if Aristophanes made fun of him in his plays, as well as Aristotle. And many of these are in the Platonic dialogues. And again, here is a link right here. You can take a look at it. But all of these dialogues feature Socrates for the most part, not until Plato is much older, writing, for example, the Laws. And the Laws don't feature, or even the Statesman. Those two do not feature Socrates, because by this point, Plato is old enough and Socrates has been gone for quite a period of time. So, but we do see him in the Apology, Erythro, Crito, Phaedo, all these particular texts written by Plato. Socrates is, in a sense, the main character. So, according to Plato, it's played out this way. Socrates is put on trial for atheism, in other words, questioning the gods, corrupting the youth, or impiety. And impiety in this case here is teaching the youth, or teaching really anyone. He would talk to everybody and would be found guilty. I'm going to ignore that phone. And he was found guilty, and his punishment was to drink hemlock, and that would kill him. And he knows it. So in the Apology, written by Plato, but featuring Socrates, Socrates looks, he at this point is outlining. You ever notice this weird thing that happens to you when a phone rings? It just gets really irritating. So it's over now. Okay, back to Socrates. In the Apology, Socrates outlines what he thinks is important for individuals to remember. And that is, it is this: an unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, a self-critical, self-analyzing life is not worth living. Don't ever do things blindly. Because if that's the case, people will know that about you and will, again, persuade, coerce you into doing and thinking things that you may not deep down, if you think about it critically, would agree with. So this was essentially the charge that was brought against Socrates, that he was corrupting the youth, again, quote unquote, by teaching them how to think critically, how to argue back with either an aristocrat or a priest or anybody. Define your terms. What do you mean by that? No, that example is not an explanation. It's an example. And so Socrates believed that an unexamined life is not worth living, and questioning, relentlessly questioning, actually brings out the best in individuals and the society in which they live. So questioning and being critical was actually a tool, a positive tool. Socrates believed that asking questions was a good thing, because when you ask a question, you identify either an asset or deficiency in the person, the institution, and the end result is you can correct that. So Socrates, again, really paradoxical. On the one hand, was not a huge fan of democracy, but fought to the death, literally to the death, to preserve it. But he said, look, if you don't think critically, if you don't examine your life and ask yourself where you are at a certain time, that is not a good life. That's an unexamined life. And Plato would confront anyone, public figures especially, and he would ask him about justice and ethics and knowledge and beauty, and then would proceed to critique their answers and would identify things like, well, listen, I've asked you, what is justice? And you've kind of just given me examples. An example is not an explanation. It's an example. Or what we'll see very shortly, to talk about morality, say, well, the God said so. Well, Socrates says, well, that's fine and good. But just because the gods say so, that's only an attribute, right? It's been attributed to someone. What is morality? What is justice? And sometimes, can you imagine, right? He would drive people crazy. But that's what Socrates did. He would always ask questions. He never stopped. So after he was condemned to die and to drink hemlock, there was an expectation that Socrates would run away. And his friends and his patrons, I'm sure Plato probably set this thing up and said, look, you can escape. You can escape and live in another city. And Socrates actually said no. Said no. Everything I've talked about, everything I stand for, everything I believe to be right would literally go out the window if I did not stand here and take my punishment, because it is brought to me by the citizens. The citizens have spoken. That's what's important. Again, paradoxical. And so Socrates, he could have escaped and escaped execution, but he said no. His loyalty to Athens and to his institutions was too great. And for him to escape would mean that he would have denigrated everything that was beautiful about Athens, about its democratic institutions. As much as he was willing to criticize them, in and of itself, they were sound ideas. So this famous painting, Socrates drinks the poisoned hemlock, and of course that's Socrates on his deathbed and still arguing, right? And they're all going, okay, look, I think this is Crito. I'm not sure the others, but here he is, still arguing, still discussing that I need to do this, right? Because if I don't stand up and I'm a martyr, then people will disbelieve that everything, or will believe that everything I said was just me wasting my breath. And that's not what he wanted to do. Now, when he was not wasting his breath, what exactly was he doing? What was he doing? What he was doing was following through what is called the Socratic Method. And the Socratic Method is just a series of questions that move inexorably towards the heart, right? The essence of the issue. And there would be simply simple questions, trying to understand something, what is really going on here? What do you mean by this? And ultimately, the kinds of questions would be metaphysical, right? They would be abstract. And things like, what is justice? What is it to know? What is beauty? And they would start as usual with examples, and very quickly Socrates would collect these examples and say, okay, but what unifies them? What is the common characteristic amongst all of these things? The moment you do that, you're going beyond the particular examples. You're getting to the heart, to the essence of the issue. And let's say the issue was beauty. You could give Socrates a list of 4 or 5 examples of beautiful things. A sunset, a beautiful face, some natural landscape. But he would say, yes, those are 3 different things. But what unifies these 3 examples? What is beauty? What is it? So what was happening was Socrates was trying to get us to look beyond the examples, beyond the purely empirical, right? Our senses being satisfied and pleased, like visually or in terms of our ear if it's beautiful music, and says, okay, but what makes it beautiful? What makes those examples beautiful? So that essentially is what the Socratic method was identifying discrepancies in an argument and identifying what makes it poor, right? No, you're attributing, the statement to someone and that makes it good. No, you just give me a bunch of examples. That's still not the essence of something. So as Socrates is thinking this way, this is exactly what what his method is all about. And so an example here from the urethro is, here is Socrates asking someone, okay, well, look, if we are talking about goodness and what pleases the gods, now in the original, they say love, but love and goodness, the word love in ancient Greece meant, or ancient Greek language meant many, many different things. Goodness certainly was one of them. So love was something in and of itself that was good and useful and worth pursuing. So goodness is what pleases the gods. So Socrates says, look, is an action good because the gods say it is good, or the gods say that an action is good because it just is a good action? In other words, Plato was trying to get the individuals in his argument to see that the gods are simply saying something that is already in and of itself a good thing. So sure, it pleases them, but that is secondary. The essence of the statement, thou shalt not lie, is not morally good because someone says so. It is in and of itself good. Thou shalt not kill. Again, it is a statement that in and of itself is good. Do not kill people. Just because the gods say so, that's just gravy, right? That literally is just a little icing on the cake. So, is something good by divine decree, or is it already in and of itself good? And so the gods are not the ones that are the standard bearers of morality. It is the thing in itself, the action in itself, that is good or bad. And this is essentially what Socrates is trying to argue in this dilemma. So the actions are good in and of themselves, and the gods simply are an attribute. They are not the essential aspect of that action. They are simply an attribute. They say so. And so these are the kinds of things. And again, imagine him saying that when people for thousands of years have worshipped the gods and goddesses, listened to what they say. You could see why he would have been charged with atheism and corruption when he's telling people, no, the gods have got nothing to do with a particular statement. The statement is either sound or unsound, good or bad, in and of itself. That's the essence of the statement, not who said it. Now, Plato worked kind of along the same lines, right? He also wanted to understand knowledge, right, as a series of abstract ideas, how that was possible. And so the main issue that he brought up or brought to the table was, what is this idea an idea of? And there are certain things that, when you think about them, really, without examples, become very difficult to discuss. And he says, for example, equality, right? What is equality when all we have is a series of examples? So this is what Plato was trying to do, was get to the heart or to the essence of something. And this would be the realm of ideas. What is equality in and of itself? Not just the examples, but in and of itself. So he said, look, we have this theory of ideas or forms. And we see these forms expressed in our reality in certain ways. So the first thing we need to do is to distinguish between the appearance of the idea, right, the particular form that it takes, and reality. But we want knowledge of reality. We wish to know about it. We don't want to be empirical about it and just rely on our sense data. We need instead to follow through and say, okay, what exactly is going on here? We need knowledge of reality. So particular things belong to appearances, right? It relies on we see it through our senses. We're able to understand what it is, but it still doesn't give us, in this case, the idea of beauty, right? We know they are beautiful, but we want to know what is it about all beautiful things? What is it that they have in common? So the only way to achieve this idea, this theory of beauty as an idea, right? The idea of beauty, because it changes constantly, the only way we can tap into it, according to Plato, is to use reason, right? And reason is, to him, what is real. So reason, the idea that we are able to grasp using reason, that's what really matters. So for Plato, what really matters, what is true reality, is the objective truth of these eternal ideas that have always been there. The notion of justice and beauty and these kinds of things have always been there, and it is our capacity to use reason that allows us to see it. So a very quick example and a useful one here, right up here. So we have the form of beauty. What is beauty? Okay, well, I think it is of a certain quality. There's some aesthetic quality to it. So we say, here's the form that we're looking at, beauty. Now, the concept of beauty now has to be expressed in a series of individual beautiful entities. So a beautiful vase, a beautiful woman, a natural landscape, a beautiful flower. Each of them are pleasing to the eye. Each of them have some sort of positive aesthetic quality that fills us with awe or fills us with some kind of sentiment. But the concept of beauty, now of course beauty is just this free-floating idea, because that's the form. The concept of it is expressed through these individual entities, and then imitations, right? This is for Plato, because he had a really strange relationship with art. He thought that paintings or sculptures of things would be the lowest form, right? So in this case, imitations of a beautiful woman or a beautiful face, imitations of a beautiful landscape. Those are the ones that are corruptible. They are simply reflections, right? They are shadows of the real thing, shadows of the real flower, the real mountainside, the real beautiful face, Mona Lisa or whoever. So this is how we're able to sort of think through using reason. We start from the pictures, then we work our way back to the actual thing that inspired the artist. And the artist is trying to capture this concept of beauty in what he or she has seen out in the world. But what they're all aiming for is this, right? The form of beauty. So that is essentially what Plato is talking about. So knowledge of ideas is what matters, right? Not particular instances or particular examples. A triangle is an idea we hold in our mind, but we will see always expressed in the natural world only approximations, right? We know how to identify them. There's usually three sides, roughly 60 degrees apart. And we know that in total they should add up to 180, but it isn't a specific triangle. It's not the one that is hanging off your pool table when you want to set up your billiard balls, because we see it as a triangular shape, right? It's triangular, right? Not a triangle. But for Plato, what matters is this, right? The knowledge of triangle, the idea of triangle. That, to him, is the true reality that we should think about and know about. Now, that distinction between appearance and reality, right, between particularity and ideas, this is the issue of what would later be called universals, right? Something that those things all share in. So we have a particular example of a universal thing, which is either equality or truth or beauty or triangle or whatever it may be. So we know, for example, in the idea of equality, we can see examples of it, but we never see it we never see equality as an idea, right? We only see some version of it, some particular version of it in the world, but we can still understand the notion of equality. Things are equal because they're all 4 inches long. Things are equal because they're all the same size in diameter. But we see it and we understand, using reason, that they are all equal in size or shape or weight or color or whatever. But equality in and of itself is simply a concept. It is simply something we apply to the real world because it is up here in our minds, and we use reason to retrieve it, to look at something and say, yes, they are essentially the same. They are equal. So if that's the case, ultimately for Plato, he believes that we can only ever have knowledge of ideas. The knowledge that will last, and that is eternal, that is objective, and of course the little qualifier made by God, these ideas are the only thing that matters. So if that's the case, those ideas are really the only things that we should learn and study and respect. So particular examples that we encounter in our empirical world, in our sense data world that we experience, those particulars will decay, they will come into being and die away. They are subjective. How many times have you bitten into something and you go, oh, that's ever sweet? You give it to your friend, they take a bite out of it. Oh, it's great. Oh, I love it. So something like sweet and sour, or tart, or flavors and so on, highly subjective. And it depends what else you've just eaten or drank just before that may alter your ability to taste something. So what Plato is going on about is knowledge of ideas. These timeless, eternal ideas that are metaphysical, that you can reach into ether using reason. And by comparison, the empirical world, right? The empirical particulars and examples all die away. Those are not genuine objects of knowledge. So as we are looking at the world, and whether we're searching for reality or simply experiencing it and encountering it, we're acquiring knowledge of the realm of ideas using our reason, because we tap into categories. When we talk about Kant in probably about a month or so, the same idea is going to come up. And Kant, again, is addressing issues that is trying to reconcile this empirical and rational viewpoint. And he says, look, you're both right and you're both wrong. And Plato is kind of doing the same thing, but clearly aligning himself towards the ideas and not so much towards the particular examples. But he will grant us this, that we acquire knowledge of the idea through reason, but we experience it starting from the particular, right? The material world, that real world that we know, to the idea that happens to shape the reality that we are experiencing. So that is the knowledge that is for sure, that is eternal, that is objective, right? The idea that we see reflected back in the form that reality takes at a given time. So just a quick recap here. We do it for time here, so it's already an hour. Okay, so in the theory of forms, we have essentially 4 things, right? There are concrete particulars, right? Examples that we encounter empirically. And then there are abstract forms or ideas that we encounter rationally. We can only have genuine knowledge of forms and ideas. So genuine as opposed to subjective or opinion. Genuine knowledge is only of forms and ideas, according to Plato. Third, our knowledge of those forms and ideas transcend, right? Go beyond. Again, we are metaphysical creatures. We are constantly building that bridge to that other world because we believe that other world is more real, more stable, more eternal and objective. So our knowledge of these forms and ideas transcend, go beyond concrete particulars. And the last one, the problem of universals, right? How is it that things can all have or can share in certain aspects? Let's say I talked a moment ago about taste. So you put a grain of sugar and a grain of salt. They're all about the same size. They're both white, and yet they taste very differently. So the universal aspect is the size and the color of those two grains, and yet they taste differently. So the problem of universals, those are things that many examples can share in, but are sometimes quite different. The color red, or a triangular shape, these kinds of things. The problem of universals is solved by this notion of forms and ideas, right? Knowledge of forms and ideas. They are abstract, they're timeless, they will last forever. And those are the things that according to Plato, participate or form the real world that we know imperfectly and in a way that will eventually perish. So we need to be mindful of that. Now, another issue too that is important for Plato, and again, this should come as no surprise, because body versus soul, body is that empirical matter, right? That vessel we live in, and the soul, which is, again, the word soul is this one of these unique words in the Greek vocabulary, which aligns itself with reason and rationality, with spirit, and so on. So, sure enough, Plato was a rationalist. He believed that reason, or the soul, was the more important of the two in that equation, because reason is the only source of knowledge, not the body, not the empirical sense data that we collect through our eyes and ears and touching, but in fact, the soul, or reason, the mind, is the only genuine source of knowledge. So if that's the case, and he was looking at his model of an ideal society, which is the republic, he applied exactly the same sort of thing, right? He says, look, the body should not rule over the mind. It should be the other way around. So the body, as you can imagine, would be, the demos, right? The word democracy comes from the Greek word demos, the people. So the people should not rule, the mind should. So reason and rationality should. So the body, which is the mass of people, all the various individuals that go together to make a society, they should be ruled over by what he wished to be a philosopher king. And Plato spent his entire writing life, his adult life, trying to describe what would be an ideal leader. And first it was a philosopher king, and then eventually it was a statesman, and with versions in between, but always someone who was wise. That was the most important thing. So his ideas that are expressed in the Republic, his ideas about political philosophy, also have to do with this very abstract notion of justice, right? The nature of justice. And this also comes from Parmenides, this balance of forces. And prior to that, the Sophists argue that justice, it doesn't mean anything. It's simply might makes right. And again, Plato and Socrates argue against this notion. And they are very clear as to the reason why. Because prior to this aristocratic rule, even though Plato was an aristocrat, he said, look, it's not about the stronger party. Might makes right. In fact, he says in, forget which one, but one of his dialogues, that he says laws are created to protect the weak. He's not saying in a derogatory way. He's saying in order to stop the forces of aristocracy and power and wealth to overrun the demos, we need to maintain a balance, and laws are there to protect those individuals. So it's always about maintaining a particular balance in society. So the notion of might makes right is very important, because he has to argue against that. Because if that is the case, as Parmenides had described last week, that justice is a balance of forces, an equal amount of force on both sides, then power, you throw that into it, and it's an imbalance of power. There is more on one side than on the other. In fact, it could be excessively so. More power, economic wealth, military might. So there is an imbalance in that society. And for Plato, this was not a good thing at all. So the argument for justice, or the argument for balance, Socrates makes that, look, even though you could turn around and you could force others to do things, that's not how you may come into power this way, but you can't maintain it for very long. Because instead of people being in competition with one another, there has to be a common goal, a common movement towards a desired end. The end, of course, is a functioning society. So justice itself, right? It's not something that belongs to individuals, remember, the body, but to society. And against, in a sense, the mind or the soul, like what we carry around inside us, right? That social imaginary. So justice is about the way that society is structured, not the way that individuals deal necessarily with each other. And to say, look, power is not the way you describe it as might makes right. It's not going to last very long. In fact, it's going to crush any democratic hopes that you may have. So the notion of a common project is important, because if you have one group of people overpowering another, you will have no collaboration between the two. And collaboration is necessary for these institutions to come into being. So there has to be a common set of rules that everyone can adhere to. And sure, they can be broken from time to time, and that's not a good thing. It's not saying that, this is welcome. It may happen. But if that were the case, then social collaboration, trust, the fear of being overrun or being lied to, those things, those aspects of social interaction would eventually break down the society itself. So it would literally corrupt from the inside. So the argument for justice is exactly that because all of us have a common goal, we should collaborate rather than be in competition with one another. And those that do will eventually suffer the consequences, because there won't really be much left of that society. So what the Republic is about is this just society, a society built on balance and social cooperation. Now, the mistake that Plato makes, because some individuals, if you get into university or you're writing about Plato, many people argue that Plato's Republic is an example of fascism. Others say it's a form of communism. It's a weird hybrid of both. It is both neither and a little bit of both. And so where the issue lies is the structure of that society. It's hierarchical. In other words, it's vertically integrated. So we have the philosopher king at the top. Then we have the guardians, who can be both male and female. They are themselves protected by a soldier class. And at the very bottom is the demos, right? The common people, the body that allows that society to continue to function because they do the work. So does that sound democratic? Does that sound fair? Does that sound just? To our eyes and ears, it doesn't. But this was how Plato was able to deal with the issue of the balance of power. He thought, or he viewed this balance, this structure, as fair. That there would be an equal amount of balancing throughout all the different facets of society, and everything was going to work just fine. But we know that the description that I've just given you, this hierarchical or vertical system, is one that does not work very well, because this is what I mean, where it's neither fascistic or communistic. It's a weird mixture of both. And where this really matters is in Plato's idea of specialization. And specialization is this notion that every individual in that society will do something that will contribute to the overall good. And some citizens will protect others. They're either the guardian class or the soldier class, while others will govern. They may have had an aristocratic background, so they're kind of used to being in power, kind of used to being wealthy and powerful. Okay, another issue with Plato. But the notion is specialization. But that begs the question, I don't want to be a fisherman. I hate the smell of fish. Plato says, I'm sorry, but we need to have 44 fishermen here, but that's what you're going to do, right? Your proper abilities, we think you'll be just a fine fisherman. And you say, no, but I want to build chairs, or I want to work in the salt mines or something. It doesn't matter. But Plato believed in specialization, and each person would work to the best of their abilities, but contribute to the overall good. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. So justice was about filling that person's appropriate role, whether it is in terms of governing, in terms of protecting, or in terms of manufacturing and producing. Those are the three sort of main areas that Plato wished to talk about. So his notion of democracy is really an ideal, because each person is assigned a particular task that is allegedly suited to the best of their abilities, and they together will work for a common good, which is to allow that society to continue to exist. That work has got to be done, and we are hoping that it will continue simply because all the things that need to be done will be done. So the only issue, though, is, well, is there an abuse of power? Remember those aristocrats always trying to undermine democracy, just like the wealthy and powerful are trying to do that today. Allegedly, according to Plato, upbringing, education, and social circumstances will stop that from happening. Well, that's a wonderful idea, and I hope it happens. So justice in this utopian republic is a very odd sort of configuration, because justice is about society at large. It's about balancing these various forces between the rulers and the protectors and the producers, keeping those three forces balanced, and then within each of those, keeping balances within it, so that everything is all kind of measured out. And the notion of justice, which is the foundation of the republic, will be able to be maintained. So we look at it as, we look at justice, which again, remind yourself that it comes out of pre-Socratic thinking. It's about observing the world, observing reality, the natural world. So the notion of justice is imported from pre-Socratic thinking about nature as a kind of, natural balance, and applied to a political concept. But it is applied to the political idea or the social idea rather than to individuals. So it is ultimately almost a utilitarian viewpoint, because in Book 4, and I'll read this here, our aim in founding the state was not the greater happiness of any one class, but the happiness of the whole. Justice is doing one's own business. And there it is. That's utilitarian thinking for the first time in the history of philosophy that we know, that we have. So that's how he's able to do it. He's able to say, okay, this is how it's going to work. We need to be utilitarian about it. It's always about the greater good. And if individuals are bitching about where they are, so be it. Because what matters is society as a whole. In other words, not the body, but the soul. Not the body, but the mind. And all of these aspects, right, these abstract ideas are basically what Plato considers to be most important. Now, the danger is in this, and it clearly is a danger, is you become enslaved to this abstract idea. It becomes almost a second order reality. And you now wish to move everything under it, which are your particular examples, to align with it. And when that's what happens, that's when you slide into fascism. Everyone is the same. Everyone is now going to work for the nation state. So here is Plato for the first time speaking from a utilitarian point of view and saying that this is the best way to achieve a just society, so that it's not happiness of one class or even an individual, but happiness of society as a whole. Still should look at it because we can see where it's going wrong. And we see how individuals are not kept as happy or as happy as they should be, as opposed to focusing exclusively on society, right? Exclusively on the abstract.